History as it happens, December 10th, 2024. The new economy.
The performance of the new economy has been powered by technology, driven by ideas, rooted in innovation and enterprise.
Can you explain what Internet is?
Just what is this main artery of the information superhighway?
To what degree are we in a new economy? And if one defines that as an Internet-driven one, I think the answer is that we are moving rapidly into that.
When you are the world's most competitive nation in so many of these important new areas of growth, what we should be supporting is free trade.
They've signed 5 separate trade agreements with us. They violated all 5 trade agreements.
Telecommunications giant WorldCom may declare bankruptcy tonight.
What is going on in our country today that allows for the kind of corporate thievery and deception? What are we in Congress really, beyond sound bites, going to do about it?
Let's continue to explore the origins of our working class discontent, because it wasn't supposed to be this way, not in our internet age. As free trade expanded and productivity increased, the new economy was supposed to lift all boats, yet it proved to be an illusion. Or did it? That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The unemployment rate has stayed below 4% for 20 months in a row, the longest stretch in 50 years.
Very simple word, groceries. Like almost, who uses the word? I started using the word, the groceries. When you buy apples, when you buy bacon, when you buy eggs, they would double and triple the price.
That a new economy was sort of meaning that old issues, whether it's keeping interest rates high to avoid inflation or whether union management relations, that all these old issues were sort of dead.
I want to welcome all of you here for this conference. Let's get right to work.
April 5th, 2000.
We meet in the midst of the longest economic expansion in our history, and an economic transformation as profound as that led us into the Industrial Revolution.
President Bill Clinton kicks off a White House conference on the new economy, and the future did look good.
Supercomputers, for example, have helped Detroit automakers cut the development times of new cars by half or more. They've helped pharmaceutical companies cut down the development of the development time for new anti-cancer drugs by several years. Clearly, they will have a profound effect, information technologies, in biomedical sciences in the 21st century. As we see by the simple fact that in the next few weeks we will announce for the first time the complete sequencing of the human genome, something that would have been literally impossible without information technology.
Unemployment was low, inflation was dormant, the stock market boomed, major industries had been deregulated, and Congress was getting ready to pass a big trade deal with China.
It's good because for the first time in 20 years, we'll have a greater opportunity to sell goods into China, and we will get China to agree to make commitments that they will be required to live up to, not only to the U.S., but to the 135 members of the WTO.
And as historian Nelson Lichtenstein notes in A Fabulous Failure, the Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism, the lead speaker at that conference was Abby Joseph Cohen, a famous and hyper-bullish stock market analyst from Goldman Sachs.
Over the last 10 years, this economy has been blessed, I believe, by improvements in 2 broad categories. Number 1, solid economic policy, and secondly, an improvement in the behavior of U.S. corporations.
An improvement in the behavior of U.S. corporations. Well, corporations love the new climate. As Lichtenstein wrote on page 411, the deregulatory ethos was greatly advanced by its linkage to the ideological power generated by those who foresaw an American new economy in the making. Heavily influenced by libertarian currents swirling out of Silicon Valley, both liberals and conservatives partook of this economic elixir, writes Lichtenstein, with Newt Gingrich as well as Al Gore sharing in the excitement. A case in point was the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which changed the fundamental rules governing the world of electronic and digital information, all in the name of deregulation and creation of an information superhighway traversing the new economy. Gore, the administration's point man on this reform, asserted that the administration sought open and free competition that would unleash consumer demand for the information products and services that will educate, entertain, and empower our people.
It's me, Ernestine, Al Gore.
Oh, Mr. Veep, surfing the net. Downloading images of global climate change again? You crazy guy. It's true what I've been telling my friends. You're not stiff. You're just a techno nerd. I can just see the headlines. Bill signs bill. And you, Mr. Smarty Pants, if you know so much, how come you're not signing the bill?
The 1996 Act, writes Lichtenstein, lifted many regulatory limits on cable television and allowed the regional telephone companies, the Baby Bell offspring of AT&T, to go into cable and long-distance service. Above all, it ended most merger restrictions in an industry that accounted for more than 15% of the entire economy.
This law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep.
And again, that is historian Nelson Lichtenstein at UC Santa Barbara, the director of the Center for Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He will join us in a moment. So one company that exploited the opening to a wondrous high-tech tomorrow was WorldCom, whose growth at all costs mantra fed on the perceived unlimited growth that the internet and telecommunication bubbles were creating. But when that bubble burst, as all bubbles eventually do, it exposed massive accounting fraud at WorldCom, fraud perpetrated to mislead investors to keep their money coming. And it led to hearings in 2002.
In the late 1990s, many so-called experts proclaimed that there was virtually unlimited potential for telecommunications companies to carry high-speed data over their fiber optic networks. As we have seen recently with the difficulties experienced by Global Crossing and others, that demand did not materialize.
The two important questions that we have to address today and in the future are, first, what is going on in our country today that allows for the kind of corporate thievery and deception that we are seeing? And secondly, what are we in Congress really, beyond sound bites, going to do about it?
I've been instructed by my counsel not to testify based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional rights. After careful consideration, I have decided to follow my counsel's instruction, even though I do not believe I have anything to hide in these or any other proceedings.
And to return to Lichtenstein's writing on page 413, when the dust settled early in the 21st century, a series of bankruptcies had wiped out $2.8 trillion in stock market valuation, with WorldCom the single biggest bankruptcy in American history to that time, as the NASDAQ Telecom Index plummeted 92% from its March 2000 peak. More than 500,000 jobs were lost in the single industry, with unionized workers taking the biggest hit. Most of the new wireless and cable firms were resolutely anti-union. This was a far larger debacle than the S&L crisis in the 1980s, he writes, and compared to the simultaneous dot-com crash, the telecom bust was far more consequential. The swift fall among the high-tech stocks nearly pricked a stock market bubble. After all, many Silicon Valley startups had no actual product, no income, and few employees. But the telecom collapse destroyed companies whose component parts and the modestly good jobs that went with them often stretched back a century. Consumers soon paid higher prices for telephone and cable service. Deregulation of the telecom industry, that was a mistake, concluded Laura Tyson some years after she left her NEC post. And I would add, less than a decade later, another bubble burst, also brought on by a misplaced, even delusional faith in the capacity of profit-driven enterprises to regulate themselves. Let's fast forward to 2008.
Dr. Greenspan, I want to start with you. You were the longest-serving chairman of the Federal Reserve in history, and during this period of time, you were perhaps the leading proponent of deregulation of our financial markets. You have been a staunch advocate for letting markets regulate themselves. And my question for you is simple. Were you wrong?
Partially, but let's separate this problem into its component parts. I took a very strong position on the issue of derivatives.
Let me interrupt you because we do have a limited amount of time, but you said in your statement that you delivered the whole intellectual edifice of modern risk management collapsed. You also said those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief, end quote. Now that sounds to me like you're saying that those who trusted the market to regulate itself, yourself included, made a serious mistake.
Well, I think that's true of some products, but not all. I think that's the reason why it's important to distinguish the size of this problem and its nature.
You had an ideology. You had a belief that that free, competitive, and this is your statement, I do have an ideology. My judgment is that free, competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We've tried regulation, none meaningfully worked. That was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. Do you feel that your ideology pushed you to make decisions that you wish you had not made?
Well, remember that what an ideology is a conceptual framework with the way people deal with reality. Everyone has one. You have to exist, you need an ideology. The question is whether it is accurate or not. And what I'm saying to you is, yes, I found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact.
You found a flaw in the reality?
A flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology, was not right. It was not working.
Precisely.
The legendary Alan Greenspan, kinda, sorta admitting that his free market ideology missed the mark. Now, there is more to the story of the new economy, as envisioned by President Clinton and many others, than the problems caused by deregulation. That alone cannot explain how we got to this point in American history, the age of Trump. Anti-establishment populism, a backlash to globalization, what some call neoliberalism. Other parts of the story are faith in technology to solve problems.
I believe the computer and the internet give us a chance to move more people out of poverty more quickly than at any time in all of human history. I believe we can harness the power of the new economy to help people everywhere fulfill their dreams.
And a belief that free trade with China, for example, would help the U.S. as much as it would help the other country. And if the economic benefits were mixed, free trade turned out to be politically toxic. Here's Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton a couple of years ago, marking the anniversary of China's entry into the WTO.
Millions of Americans lost good-paying, blue-collar jobs to the China trade shock in the years that followed. Countless small towns, main streets, and working-class neighborhoods were gutted and boarded up.
And as our guest in this episode notes, the term new economy would fade in the new century, replaced by gig economy, surveillance capitalism, and the fissured workplace. Terms that still apply in today's climate, one in which great macroeconomic numbers mean little to working-class Americans, if we're to believe what some say are the real lessons of the 2024 election. Nelson Lichtenstein, welcome back to the show.
Delighted to be here.
It's been about a year, and I've been talking about your book on the show quite a bit. I've mentioned it in my newsletter, so I thought I should actually just have you back on to continue this discussion because, I can't tackle big subjects in one podcast episode alone. So, under the rubric of how did we get here in the United States in the age of Trump, why is there so much working class discontent? I keep coming back to your book, A Fabulous Failure.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, good. Okay, good.
It refreshed my memory because I lived through that period, but I was a teenager. I wasn't paying attention. Right. Before we get to Clinton and the quote unquote new economy, what is your take on this disconnect? Because I've been thinking about this disconnect in preparation for this podcast between the macroeconomic picture that Biden and his surrogates were talking about and the lived experience of the working class who didn't want to hear about all the macroeconomics.
Right. That's the question of the day because, there was no payoff to the presumably prosperity of the Biden moment and in terms of the election. The phrase lived experience, I think that is a key to it because We had something really extraordinary happen during the pandemic and shortly thereafter. That is something which was out of kilter with the general austerity of American budgets. In March of 2020, it was under Trump, but it was really the Democrats pushed it, but it was sort of a bipartisan. We had this gigantic CARES Act, I think 2.2 trillion, which basically, sent checks to people who are being laid off. It stopped evictions. It did an enormous number of things, getting money to the bottom of the working class. And then in February of 2021, with Biden, the American Rescue Plan, another almost $2 trillion. So you had this enormous social welfare spending, really. Student loans didn't have to be repaid. You couldn't be evicted. Savings accounts were expanding. And I'm not talking about the rich. I'm talking about people at the who are at the very bottom. We almost had for a moment a Nordic welfare state in America. But what happened was that this was temporary. When it began to evaporate or end, and that was around late 2022, 2023, it was partly because of the divisions in the Democratic Party. Manchin and Sinema weren't willing to sign on for more. It was, of course, the Republicans by that point were against. Ordinary people, all of a sudden, who weren't paying attention to the conflicts in Congress or whatnot. What happened? I was getting all this money for my child care, and it stopped. Now my student loans are due. I may be evicted. Hey, things were pretty good back there under Trump, and now they aren't. And I think that is as important as the inflation in explaining, as it were, this particular moment of lived experience, that the sort of social infrastructure law, as it were, Biden would succeed in getting a kind of, the CHIPS Act and the infrastructure, building highways and things. He got that. And that takes a while for that to get through the pipeline. But the social side of it, the family supports and things of that sort, which we didn't get, meant from the point of view of ordinary people, their conditions were worse in 2023 or 2024. Compared to 2020 or 21. Yeah. So they just, hey, yeah. So, I think that helps as much as inflation. I think that explains it. What the tragedy here is that Biden and his people that he put in place, and this was really part of a kind of a deal with the Warren and Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. This was ambitious. This was a break from the Clinton-Obama neoliberalism. And it was only halfway completed. And now what happened? Now I'm struggling once again, paycheck to paycheck, and inflation's going up. So I think that's part of it. We had 40 years or really half a century of austerity and neoliberalism. And, it's hard to reorganize, that in a fundamental way. And so
I was going to say austerity for everyone except the Pentagon.
Well, right, of course, at the very top.
The Pentagon. The Pentagon budget there's no austerity there, but yeah.
That's been going on. I have to say one thing about the phrase, and now more than 10 years ago, the phrase, the 1% and the 99%. I've never been a fan of that because from the point of view of ordinary people who are part of the 99%, they never see the 1%. Maybe they see it in a television. They never encountered it. What they see and what they encounter is I'm working a precarious job, and here's Joe. Someone else is working a kind of steady job. They're all part of the 99%. In fact, the income may not be that different, but I think those distinctions are what's really important. Sometimes that leads to resentment, for example, against public employees who often have a more permanent job. People never encounter the 1%. And here, let me say this, something that the UAW just did in its strike and negotiations of last year. One of the major grievances that auto workers had was the two-tier pay system, where some people would be making, $22 an hour and others making 30 doing the same job. It was an irritant. It was inequitable. And I think people felt that in a stronger fashion than even, the fact that we had, Musk and other billionaires running around. And the UAW got rid of that. That was a tremendously progressive thing. It will have payoffs in terms of working class solidarity down the line.
That was a comprehensive answer. Nelson, thanks for being on the show. We'll see you.
Sorry for too much.
You're right. The pandemic exposed holes in American capitalism, if you will. It showed how skimpy the safety net was. So you get the $2 trillion CARES Act. That was under Trump, March 2020. CARE stood for Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. Then in March 2021, 1 year later, Biden is now the president. You get the American Rescue Plan. And you're right, the industrial policy stuff, that's going to take some time. The infrastructure bill, the Green New Deal, which was really part of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction, I think it was, Act, IRA. That was really a climate bill. And the CHIPS Act. Those are three, if I'm not leaving anything out, three big pieces of industrial policy. You don't see the immediate effect of that.
Dan wrote a piece on this, and he made the point, and I think it's a good point, that we could do a lot to enhance manufacturing in the United States, and that's what the Biden plan, what survived of the Biden initiative was, let's get manufacturing going for cars and the green transition and things of that sort. Manufacturing does not employ as many people as it used to. So the social impact is somewhat less than it might have been 50 years ago. What does employ a lot of people are retail, and hospitality and service sector and things of that sort. And clearly there was a need for it. The so-called Great Resignation meant that people were finally, jumping out of their McDonald's job and getting some other. And that's what was the whole income supports and social supports for that service sector was not enacted. And I think that's another one of the reasons that ordinary people, workaday people, didn't see the prosperity as, helping them.
Since you brought up Danny Roderick, I was going to bring this up during our conversation. I'll mention it right now. Yes. He says there's the possibility that Bidenomics was economic populism of the wrong kind. Yeah. He says by focusing on manufacturing, old-style union power and worker organizations, and geopolitical competition with China, it paid too little attention to the changing structure of the economy. We're going to get to that with your historical work about the changing structure of the economy. Yeah. And he says the nature of the new working class. In an economy where only 8% of workers are employed in manufacturing, a policy that promises to restore the middle class by bringing manufacturing home is not only unrealistic, it rings hollow, he says, because it does not align with workers' aspirations and everyday experiences. So there you go.
Right. I really do agree with that, and I as the author of a book on Walmart, which is has many hundreds of thousands more workers than General Motors, I totally agree with that, and I think there was the possibility. I think here's what sort of the tragedy is. I think there was the possibility in this last 3 years post-pandemic period to transform the nature of that service work, that retail work. That's what the Great Resignation was all about. People were discontent. They had market power and they were moving, and wages did go up for, retail and food service, et cetera. And that could have been reinforced had the social part of the Inflation Reduction Act been put in effect, because then you would have had people, receiving money or support for childcare and for, all sorts of other social services. And they would say, take this job and, screw it. Unless you pay me, considerably more. Not to mention the fact that the minimum wage remains at $7.25 an hour. No one's paying that, but it remains there rather than $15 or $17 or $19 an hour where it should be. So I think that's part of the missed opportunity of this last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think the Inflation Reduction Act was a bad name too, but okay.
Well, right, because
yes.
Right.
Yeah, really. Well, okay. We'll save that for part 2 of this conversation. So that's the current situation. What I hope to accomplish with our conversation is give people an idea. They should read your book as well. And I've been talking about this on the podcast a lot lately in different conversations, different contexts. How did we get to this point when there are so many hopes and dreams, or as you said, a wondrous high-tech future? So we'll go back in time to the 1990s, late 1990s, turn of the century. What was the new economy? What was that supposed to be?
Right. It was a phrase which purported to describe technological and organizational change that had taken place in the American economy. I should just mention that the phrase, if you look at one of these diagrams of the use of phrase in the newspapers. And there's a huge spike. It's about 1995, 96. And then in 97, then it drops off. That was a sort of a moment. It was being touted by not just the Clinton administration, but various newspapers and Wall Street. Well, okay, what it was, it had a lot to do with Silicon Valley and the digitalization of information and the economy. It was once said by an economist that computers are marvelous. They've changed everything except the productivity statistics in the office. I mean, but by the 1990s, they were having an impact. There was an impact that was taking place. But everyone from Alan Greenspan on the right, he was head of the Federal Reserve Board, to Robert Reich on the left, were touting that a new economy was sort of meaning that old issues, whether it's keeping interest rates high to avoid inflation or whether union management relations, meant that all these old issues were sort of dead. We didn't have to deal with them because the new economy was solving that problem, sort of ipso facto. And
because of the advent of information technology, that was a big part of it.
This is true of all social prognosticators. I mean, it's true then, now, you can find it everywhere. Something new does happen. It's real. It's new. Cheap satellites or electric cars or what's the latest? AI is the latest
crypto.
and so they say, oh, well, that's going to change everything. I mean, all 130 million jobs I mean, you can have a new technology or a new innovation or something, but the overwhelming majority of people are still doing what they were doing. People who are intellectuals and here from Clinton to Robert Reich to Alan Greenspan, they project these transformations that are way beyond what is actually happening. And, it's in human nature to do that. Just to take Robert Reich, who was one of the key proponents of this, today very much on the left, by the way, but then more of a centrist figure. He thought, oh, we're all going to be, because of the computer, because of technology, we'll all be knowledge workers, we'll all be, manipulating symbols. I mean, yeah, there are people manipulating symbols, sure, but that's still a small minority of all American workers. The fastest growing occupations in the 1990s were not computer programmers, but were, home healthcare aides and people working in hospitals, orderlies. I mean, these were the fast-growing occupations.
Yeah.
You still had that.
I want to get to how the new economy was very much like the old economy, but you hinted at it there. There was an ideology behind this as well, pervading everything: labor relations, monetary policy, trade, telecom, banking, free trade. An ideology that we don't really need the activist state, the Keynesian pro-labor union idea anymore, that the new economy would be different.
Yes, that this new structure of the way the society was going to be conceived as a result of information technology meant that old class conflict or issues of poverty or issues of restraining inflation, that these would be just evaporate. So take Greenspan, for example, who's usually thought to be quite a conservative guy. He was, but he became enamored of the idea that because of information technology, productivity was increasing very rapidly in American industry, American economy, and therefore, when real wages were going up, profits were going up, he did not have to put on the brakes and raise interest rates. And that was a sort of fight that took place inside the Federal Reserve in the mid-1990s. He said, we don't need to do that. Well, they didn't do that. And what you ended up with, you got a boom, and then a bubble, and then a crash. But Greenspan had bought into that. A woman like Janet Yellen, who was a more traditional, and she was more of a liberal, but she said, wait, no, that's not happening. We should actually put on the brakes a little bit more. And we're getting a bubble, we're getting a boom that's unsustainable, but Greenspan didn't listen. So we ended up with first the dot-com bubble that burst in 2001, and then later on the really big bubble that burst in 2008,
and the telecom bubble as well in 2000.
Right. Oh yes, there was also telecom. Let me just say this telecom. Let me mention some.
Sure, I have a bunch of questions about that, but you can go to it now. Yeah.
Let me talk. The Telecommunications Reform Act of 1996, I think it was. Al Gore and Bill Clinton were both pushing this, and this was going to be kind of a signature reform to unleash unleash the internet, and there was when they were in the process of pushing this, there was a kind of photo op where Al Gore and Bill Clinton are installing fiber optic cable in some classroom, so that everyone will have the internet. That was the idea, and we'll have a deregulation of telecommunications. Now, again, it was all projected and all motivated. Oh, we're going to unleash the internet, universal availability of information.
With this legislation, we strengthen the bonds that allow us to learn together, to reason together, and to live together in peace and well-being.
It clearly enables the age of possibility in America to expand, to include more Americans. It will create many, many high-wage jobs. It will provide for more information and more entertainment to virtually every American home.
There was a little bit, some truth to that, yes. But what was really happening was that the telephone companies, the so-called baby bells, which were the regional telephone companies, which had a monopoly of, basically landlines, and then they would move into wireless pretty soon, but they had a monopoly of that. They would be unleashed to basically merge with each other and eventually gobble up AT&T, the long distance carrier, Omar Bell, which is what happened. So the rhetoric was about the World Wide Web. What was really happening was a consolidation and merger of telephone companies, really old-fashioned, and creating new monopolies. And that happened. There was overexpansion, and then there was a bust that took place again in the early 21st century.
I was going to mention WorldCom. People have forgotten WorldCom.
Yes,
WorldCom merged with MCI. I was going down a rabbit hole to prepare to speak to you, Nelson. I found an FCC news release from 1998, WorldCom and MCI, the merger there.
Right.
Well, because of that optimism that internet growth was going to be off the charts, it led WorldCom to basically feed on this optimism and overstate internet adoption, right? So they can continue to get more and more investor money, and they overextended themselves with all these acquisitions and mergers, etc. So they then had to lie about their bottom line. There's just this atmosphere of irrational exuberance. Was that what Greenspan would have called it? Led to these completely fraudulent accounting practices at WorldCom, which, as you note in your book, was the biggest bankruptcy in history. And we're not even talking 2024. This is in 2000. So we already see the consequences here.
Joseph Stiglitz pointed this out, and he was a kind of a somewhat of a critic of this merger mania in the world of Silicon Valley and other related and telecommunications and other. What you want is a monopoly, and so therefore you're willing to go into debt enormously and do all sorts of things that are semi-legal to get that sort of first mover advantage, so that you kind of monopolize the whole thing, and then you can't have competition. Then you can make tons of money, and you can see that clearly with the social media firms today in Silicon Valley. But this was true 30 years ago in telecom, where we do have the baby bells, so-called baby bells. They were actually quite large. They basically have moved now into wireless, and they basically have kind of monopolies of service in many places.
Anyone listening to this show who's under the age of, I don't know, 30 or 40 is wondering what's a landline, what's a baby bell, and all that. The story is not entirely bad. I did find online archives for the Clinton White House. There are online archives of what they accomplished during their 8 years in office. There's one page that says, Unleashing the New Economy. Between 1993 and 2000, Clinton invested an additional $10 billion in a range of science and technology programs, something called the 21st Century Research Fund, Research and Experimentation Tax Credit, Climate Change Technology Initiative, unprecedented investments in biomedical research, strongly supported the efforts of the National Human Genome Research Institute, et cetera, goes on and on. So there was real investment in real stuff here. It wasn't just asset bubbles. When we talk about what's gone wrong in the last quarter century, we talk about asset bubbles. But there was, real progress here, if you will.
Yeah, of course, those things did happen. I mean, actually, I put it in terms of, again, you started off with the lived experience of ordinary Americans, the asset bubbles that when they did pop, that had a big impact on 401ks of lots of people, and that is one of the problems with research. It takes a while for this to have an impact. But for ordinary people, these asset bubbles destroyed the future retirement security of millions when they popped. By the way, I just read a piece by Robert Kuttner in American Prospect saying, well, we're heading for another bust. I mean, unsustainable stock market prices at this particular moment.
So we can't discuss the new economy, capital N, capital E, without some context here, because the U.S. and global economies were changing. The terrain was shifting beneath our feet, as they say. Deindustrialization, this is well before NAFTA. The decline of organized labor, these are just two examples. Can you tell us a little bit about the changes that were underway, 1970s, 1980s, the types of things that led the Reagan administration to do managed trade. And then, of course, during the Clinton years, the 1990s, they weren't just coming up with these ideas out of nowhere. They were responding to changes in global capitalism, right?
Right. After the mid-70s, trade becomes much more important than it had been, say, in the previous 50 years. And then after the fall of communism, both in terms of markets and of labor markets, you get a tremendous expansion, and then East Asia becomes also open. So you have a much more of a worldwide network of trade and of labor that can be deployed. And with the rise of simultaneously of the supply chains, which again, the key to that is containerization, which that's not a high-tech thing. Containerization, by the way, one could argue it's as important as the computer. It's a very low-tech thing. It's just big boxes, put on big ships. But it reduced the price of getting goods from East Asia or from Europe to America dramatically, which and meant that you could have worldwide supply chains, and then that's really the essence of globalization. So you don't need some fancy new technology. You just need a kind of organizational agreement that everyone's going to use the same size box. Basically, that's what it was all about. So when that happened, it did in fact mean that American industry would be subject to competition from abroad. Trade agreements like that of NAFTA, and even more important, China entering the WTO, even I think more important than NAFTA, meant that American workers would be subject to that competition. Now, economists are correct in saying that free trade is beneficial taken as a whole. That is, yes, Walmart can sell a whole basket of goods at a lower price because they come from China than otherwise. That is true. But the benefit of those lower prices is sort of spread over the entire population. So my sweater that I'm wearing, costs $20 rather than $22, and so that's good. But the damage, the pain is concentrated. It's concentrated in this Toledo factory, which shuts down, or that Ohio bicycle factory, which just shuts down. And the social cost of that is very visible, sort of toxic, and has great political consequences. And I think the architects of this free trade world, they were insufficiently understanding of that kind of disruption that was taking place.
And when you go back and listen to their speeches, the proponents of all of this, they don't talk about the drawbacks at all.
We have made a decision now that will permit us to create an economic order in the world that will promote more growth, more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility of world peace.
And they also have an enormous illusion. So Gene Sperling, Charlene Barshevsky, who was head of the trade that in those days, Clinton and Gore and everyone else, they would say, oh, we're going to trade with China. That means they're gonna have a stock market in China. That means you have to have a free press, at least a free business press. Trade is going to democratize China. I mean, they said that repeatedly when debates over China being a part of the WTO were taking place. They were just simply wrong about that.
Yeah. So we were talking about what the new economy was, what it was supposed to be, whether it was an illusion. Let's also talk about some of the stuff that sounds more like the old economy. As you say on page 439 of your book, America was generating a new economy, but it was far different from what Silicon Valley and its White House cheerleaders had imagined. Walmart and McDonald's, Amazon and FedEx, Marriott and HCA Healthcare, all were giant growth companies. Software engineers and computer support specialists were among the fastest growing occupations. But when it came to sheer numbers, occupational growth was still concentrated in low-wage, low-skilled jobs in retail trade, food preparation, in restaurants, hospitals, nursing homes, home health care, janitorial services, and offices. Jobs are often structured and supervised by a new digital infrastructure. Call center and warehouse work were prime examples, but they were hardly, you say, hardly of the sort envisioned by the new economy enthusiasts.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like that's changed much over the past 30 years.
No, I think that's still the same. Technology is there. Very sophisticated technology, both in terms of how Walmart functions, how Amazon functions, how, even home healthcare workers. But the technology is that of control. It's the algorithmic boss. People are immersed in it, but they don't control it. It's a new control mechanism. That is the new economy. You're right. And the inability of unions or of the Congress or the state to really radically raise wages and conditions in this vast 40, 50 million person sector of the economy means that all those people are living in desperation. And when demagogues come along, they are willing to follow them, whether it's anti-immigrant or whatever the latest thing is. So I think there was a possibility for a moment of a radically progressive transformation of that kind of work just in the lee of the pandemic. But I think we may have lost that moment.
And you said that I was right about something. I have to correct you. You were right about it. You wrote the book. So on that point, though, the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt was, I think the term that David M. Kennedy used to describe his attitude toward organized labor was diffident. But the New Deal did lift organized labor. It opened up the possibility where it could thrive, even if the federal government didn't put its own hand on the scale. For the first time, actually, the federal government wasn't weighing in on the side of capital. So we saw this big growth in union membership, which was possible because the types of industries that were around that could be organized. We mentioned earlier in the conversation that these service jobs, they're hard to unionize and organize because people just have them for a year or two. They're low wage, and then they move on and do something else. So I'm going to eventually get to a question here. Why was there no vision for a robust union piece in the new economy that Clinton and all those guys are talking about?
The liberal wing of the Clinton people, they came of age during the worst period of American trade unionism, not in terms of numbers or even power, but in terms of ideology. The trade union movement in America in the 1960s and 70s had no attraction whatsoever to liberals who were otherwise not part of labor. I mean, they were for the Vietnam War. They were hostile to the more advanced forms of the civil rights activism. They were anti-gay in many respects and immigrant as well. It doesn't surprise me that a young social reformer like Robert Reich or Bill Clinton, for that matter, who saw himself as unquestionably as a liberal, and in Arkansas, he wanted to develop the state of Arkansas in an economic way. He just saw labor as dull, solid, and irrelevant. And partly that was their own fault. Now, more sophisticated and ideological people, there were those around who said, yes, the labor movement must be revitalized, and we can do it. I was part of that movement in the 90s as well. But it doesn't surprise me that liberals, certain kind of liberals, saw labor as irrelevant. Now, recently, of course, we have this today. We have some elements of labor which are quite exciting and are doing things, whether it's industrial workers like in auto and under new leadership, or grad students and cultural workers, who are organizing, etc. What I find interesting today, in the New Deal, when labor was at full tide, you had a strata of businessmen, of employers who said, well, that's the future. I guess we better sign up. Maybe they wanted to sign up with the AFL, more conservative. They didn't want the Reds, but we're going to sign up. And you didn't get opposition to union organization very much, except the Deep South, in the period of the late 30s and 40s. And it was kind of easy to get unionized. Walter Reuther,
everyone was doing so well too because of the war and the contracts and everything.
Great labor leader of that, the auto workers. He said. He made the remark in the early 50s, organizing workers, that's the easy part. Unionizing is hard. What he meant was it's easy to formally get them in a union, then we have to educate them, etc. Well, today, it's just the opposite. Despite all the popularity of the union movement, and despite Biden, in fact, was pro-union, he did show up on a picket line, we don't have what I call the Eisenhower corporate leaders. We don't have the corporate leadership in the corner offices is, well, I guess we better go along with this. I guess so let's sign a deal. Let's agree to
Starbucks, Amazon, they're huge employers.
We don't have that. And I don't know what's Japanese transplant companies, the Amazons, the hospitals, the you name it. We don't have it. I mean, every so often you get a victory, maybe in the academic world, but mainly you don't. Despite all the talk of popularity of unions, et cetera, the needle hasn't moved at all in terms of their size, and potency in recent years.
A historian whose name you're familiar with, Michael Kazin, he just wrote a piece called The Decline of Union Hall Politics in Dissent, where he says the notion of some leftists that unions can revive without aid from the state and from a major governing partner, a la the New Deal, is and has always been a fantasy. Since its birth, he says, in the 19th century, the American labor movement has been endorsing politicians and fighting for laws that would improve workers' lives on and off the job. Support from the state continues to be critical to a healthy and enduring revival of the movement. And then he quotes a historian by the name of Nelson Lichtenstein. You wrote recently, quote, "The union movement's comeback in recent years could not have taken place without the existence of a set of political initiatives that generated both low unemployment and a high level of government-guided business investment. But even so, as we've been discussing here, the numbers in private sector unionization is what? 5, 6, 7%?
6%. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's how should I put it, a kind of a narrow path here. On the one hand, and there have been many examples of this in the past, that the union movement becomes too dependent on the state, but from FDR, the godfather, kind of, oh yeah, he'll protect us, too dependent on the state. And then the other side of it is a kind of almost wobbly anarchist. The state is just a repressive institution and we have to be out there, raising hell. It is a sort of dialectical kind of balancing act. I think you do want to raise a lot of hell, but you also do need state activities. And by the way, I think in the South right now, the enormous amount of money that's going into the green transition is having a salutary effect in terms of organizing. At Volkswagen, I think it was crucial, and I think it will be crucial in some of the other German companies, and also the battery plants. I mean, what's happened is that Southern politicians in the past would say, oh, we're going to give this $100 million incentive to create this plant, but quid pro quo is no union. You can't have a union. Well, today, the federal government, at least thus far, maybe not is giving $1 billion or more to set up a plant. There's no kind of quid pro quo, at least anti-union quid pro quo. So it means that the influence of Southern politicians is less and that of the federal government is more. But so I agree. Obviously, I do agree with Mike. By the way, that article that he wrote was also part of this review of a very good book by Theda Skocpol. I think it's called The Rust Belt Union Blues.
Yes.
And she looks at Western Pennsylvania, which is the crucial place in America about, politically, about what happened to the working class in Western Pennsylvania. Why is it all Trump? And she shows the way, and I've done my own research on this as well, that if you go back to the 30s and 40s and 50s, the union hall, there were 50, 100, 200 union halls were centers of activity and politics and social life and weddings.
They had newspapers.
And it wasn't that the unions were knocking on doors and handing out leaflets. This was what you were. You were a union person, and it was a social world. It was your identity, and therefore, of course, in the elections, you voted not just Democratic, you voted New Deal Democratic, you voted CIO Democratic, you voted, Labor Democratic. And that's been lost, the whole deindustrialization, and that's been lost. And so even where you have a union in Western Pennsylvania today, I think the co-author of the book walked through the parking lot of this unionized steel mill, and what did she find? She looked at the bumper stickers, the gun club here, the mega church there, the Trump, and very few, stickers for like the union,
instead of worker solidarity, you're getting a different kind of cultural
the ideology of right, and that's true. A gun club or a mega church provides that social world that was once provided by the union.
Couple of things, and I'm going to ask you my last question. We were talking about unions raising hell. Unions raised more hell after World War II was over because expectations had been raised, and that's when they started losing popular support because there were so many, even maybe during the war too. I learned this from Kennedy's book, the number of strikes, and the other thing too about a union job and what it meant to people. It reminds me of a joke Lou Costello said in one of his movies. Some guy was bossing him around, bullying him around, said to him, you've got to work all night for me here. You owe me this or that. Costello said, I'm not going to do that. I'm a union man. I only work 16 hours a day.
A union man only works 8 hours a day.
I belong to 2 unions.
By the way, I belong to 2 unions, but I'm not an active member in either because I don't have a union job right now. CWA and SAG-AFTRA. Okay, final question here, Nelson. What is today's capital N, capital E, new economy? I'm pretty sure, although I can't be positive of this, that whatever we're saying about it now is not going to turn out to be the entire case 10 or 15 or even sooner than that years from now. AI, right? All this talk about how AI is going to transform the economy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think that is some combination of an illusion, or I don't know what, a meme almost. The AI is not, it's not a thing. It's a outlook, a managerial outlook, and AI can be quite primitive in some respects or sophisticated. And I think that it's one of these ideas. There's something new there. You are aggregating huge amounts of data, and you can generate a paragraph, but it's not going to have an impact on 97% of the American people. A lot of new technology ideas and technology itself, that very concept, really, when you get down to the brass tacks, it's about the managerial mindset. How can we, control labor, production, sales in a more effective and centralized way? And that's what technology means. I mean, when you get right down to it. So what is the new economy today? Well, I think it's actually a bit of a kind of a little bit confused, mixed bag here. Obviously, there's some things, Elon Musk would have a vision,
Electric cars going to Mars, things like that.
Whatever. But I do think that it's up for grabs more today. Yeah. I do think it's up for grabs. And Trump himself, by the way, the whole Trumpite sort of moment, that itself is a mixed bag, because they're hostile to world trade. On the other hand, they're sort of, they're kind of hostile to, various kinds of the green transition. But on the other hand, they're now getting in bed with Silicon Valley. So I think it's a mixed bag and up for grabs, really. That's what I think today.
We'll see if they support things like higher minimum wages or something like that.
Right. Well, sure.
Local unionization.
By the way, just to say, the new Secretary of Labor that has been nominated, who is kind of a bit of a pro-labor Republican, I think, follow her career in the next 6 months. I think it'll be pretty rocky.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the New Deal. I said that would be my last question. I lied. Yeah. The New Deal, it was a fundamental reorientation or change to the relationship between citizens and their government. And even to a certain degree, citizens or labor and capital. We need that now. We talk about technology and all this other stuff. The basics of capitalism are there, and that is that capital still has a lot more power than labor. And I think that goes to the heart of why there's so much working class discontent. And until we do something about that, then I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think the paths that used to be available to working class discontent, to making itself manifest, have been blocked. That is, unionization is one thing, or even like regulation through the FTC or something on the other. And so the sort of a blockage, when you get a blockage, then that discontent moves into other perverse and different ways. And I think that was one of the promises of the very recent moment, was that we would have an explosion of interest in unionization. I think, by the way, if you want to know what the New Deal was like in terms of labor, look at the academy. Dramatic increase in unionization among, grad student types. And really, most administrations, most universities just sort of saying, okay, we'll let it happen. That's only one very small sector of the American economy today, but the dynamic, if it were 10 times, 100 times larger, that would be what it'd be like in the late 30s and the 40s in the New Deal. And we've seen that. And by the way, in the academy, you have the STEM people, the science, technology, they've come over to the union side. They were always hostile. They were always, negative, but they've come over to the union side. And that's what happened to various strata in the late 30s and 40s that had historically been hostile to unionism. They said, okay, you can't beat them, we'll join them.
Recently, the most notable public questions that have concerned us all have had to do with industry and labor. And with respect to these, certain developments have taken place that I consider of great importance. I'm happy to report that after years of uncertainty, culminating in the collapse of the spring of 1933, we are bringing order out of the old chaos with a greater certainty of the employment of labor at a reasonable wage and of more business at a fair profit. These governmental and industrial developments hold promise of new achievements for the nation.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the rise and fall of the Assad dynasty in Syria. Remarkable developments in the Middle East. Remember, new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter every Friday. Go to historyasithappens.com and sign up.